So good morning and welcome to our latest class on Europeanization processes in Southeastern Europe. It's a great pleasure to introduce Vjosa Musliu, who is an assistant professor at the Free University of Brussels in Belgium, and she's teaching at the political science department. And very happy, especially as Vjosa has just published a book which is about to be officially released by Routledge called Europeanization and State Building as Everyday Practices, Performing Europe and the Western Balkans. And it's, I think, part of a very important growing literature on critical Europeanization studies, which looks at Europeanization not as some of the other classes have as a process just of EU rules and their implementation and adaptation, but more as an everyday bottom-up or sometimes also top-down, but a much more kind of localized practice and everyday experience rather than in the conventional way. And I think that really adds to our understanding of the topic. So I'm very much looking forward to Vjosa telling us a little bit more about the research she's done for her book and some of the case studies in particular we'll hear about. And then afterwards, as usual, we'll have a chance to discuss it with her. So please, feel free to write any questions in the chat or comments you have, and of course in person as well at the end of the presentation. We'll be very happy to discuss them. So, Vjosa, thank you for finding the time and looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Florian. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vjosa Musliu. I am an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at the Free University in Brussels. And as was introduced very briefly now, I will be talking today mostly about Europe and processes of Europeanization as performative acts, as performative practices across the countries of the Western Balkans. And I will briefly talk also about some of the dimensions in which looking at performative acts would lead to, and how can we understand Europeanization in a more comprehensive and in a more critical way if we were to cast a look on everyday events and everyday practices. I will specifically focus on 3 cases of the book. The book touches upon many other countries in the Western Balkans, but for today's lecture, I will mainly focus on several practices and try to understand Europeanization from these practices, from these entry points, if you will. Concretely, I will look at how pride parades, LGBT+ pride parades in Pristina can be understood and can be looked at as entry point, as a fertile ground to understand entire sets of processes related to Europeanization, processes that I argue have been largely overlooked in the literature. I will also talk a little bit how the activities such as hiking or biking or cycling in and across Bosnia and Herzegovina can be also studied as an entry point to reveal entire sets of civilizational discourses and practices related to Europeanization. And I will also take a look into how the sheer activity of biking and owning a bike around the city of Tirana has also been portrayed and given forward as a performative act that will in turn make Albanians look more European. These are the everyday acts in which I focus in. But more on that a bit later. This is just to give you a bit of an overview of what the entire talk of today will be based on. And in the meantime, if somebody has a question or an intervention, feel free to either take the floor or basically just write something on the chat box, and I'll make sure to take a look at that from now on as well. The talk of today is based on this new book that I have coming up with a series of intervention and state building with Routledge. And it's basically an overview of sets of practices and performative acts in Albania, North Macedonia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo and how these acts and processes can help us understand Europeanization in a more critical way. In the book and also in the discussion of today, when I talk about how Europe is performed, of how Europe is imagined, or how Europe is even fantasized in some of these settings, in some of these countries, and in some of these societies, I just want to clarify that I'm not merely referring to it as Europe as in the European Union, as a political structure, but also at the same time, in addition to the EU as a political structure, I'm also talking about the cultural and civilizational legacy and legitimacy that Europe as a continent carries with, and also how these two, when conflated with one another, so the memory of Europe as a whole, and then politics of the European Union, in particular, when these are conflated with one another, how they are then translated into societies and into everyday acts of governments or of civil society actors across the countries of the Western Balkans. Now, for those of you who are, who have been following this master program for a while now, you have been exposed to many, many different debates from a variety of theoretical strands, methodological points of view. So why then another discussion? Why yet another talk about Europeanization of the Western Balkans? What has possibly been left untapped that it was necessary for me to join you today to talk about? Basically, what I argue in the book and what I want to set forward today is that for the most part, the overwhelming literature that studies Europeanization processes with the Western Balkans has been mainly focused on macro-political processes and has focused on structures, institutions, and political actors, but has ignored or sidelined, let's say, everyday practices that are co-constitutive to making what the EU is and what processes of Europeanization is. In that sense, I argue that, yes, we can learn a lot about Europeanization by looking at it as a methodical process of closing and opening chapters, of discussion with the political elite, reformation processes, vetting processes, rule of law reforms, civil society trainings, etc. However, in order to be able to comprehensively understand processes of Europeanization and to also be able to understand how Europe and processes of Europeanization continue to still be so appealing for the populations and the countries of the Western Balkans, we have to cast a look to how Europe is performed in the everyday realm, how Europe is performed in, let's say, in Europe Day celebrations, how it is performed into the redesigning of school curricula of, let's say, school children in Sandžak in Serbia, how it is performed when the city of Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia, was redesigned entirely so as to look as a more European city. How can we look at activities such as indeed biking and cycling, something that I hinted at before? How are these activities in turn used, portrayed, performed, and legitimized as quintessentially European acts? And how in invoking such acts, societies, leaders in their discourses are also in turn trying to portray themselves in the countries that they represent as quintessentially European. In this sense, I talk about critical Europeanization, which in the book I define as a set of practices through encounters, spaces, and subjects. These encounters are not necessarily only political. They're also at the intersection of culture, sports, politics, media, and they take place in spaces and places that are not necessarily bound to methodical processes of Europeanization. So when we try to understand Europeanization as in a critical way, then we have to look at venues that are far beyond the traditional venues where processes of Europeanization take place. That's why for the research of this book, I have done a lot of site visits. I have been to cities like Skopje, Tirana. I have attended pride parades in Pristina and also Europe Day events around Bosnia and Herzegovina to understand how Europe features, permeates, and becomes in a way omnipresent throughout city spaces, throughout social gatherings, and how then it, by becoming omnipresent, it also becomes as if it is absent and it is nowhere. And it's exactly in this omnipresence and absence of it that I trace a lot of productive potential to understand how processes of Europeanization are used in the societies of the countries that I deal with. As you know very well from your discussions in the previous weeks, processes of Europeanization in the countries of the Western Balkans cannot be decoupled from processes of state building, strictly speaking. And in a lot of ways, they are conflated. So you cannot talk about one without talking about the other. Towards the end of the talk of today, I will briefly mention something about the broader lenses through which I analyze many of these cases, and that has to do with the thesis of Balkanization set forward by Maria Todorova, and also the thesis of Orientalism. Many of you should know this, the thesis of Edward Said. All right. So let me take you case by case, and hopefully, virtually, we can walk through the streets of Pristina and Sarajevo and Tirana and try to understand where do we look for Europe if we were to look outside of the buildings of the EU delegation? Where do we look about processes of Europeanization, and what does that mean for the local populations if we were to look outside of offices and venues where agreements are signed or where approximation programs are being signed? And you might probably wondering, what do pride parades and LGBT plus politics have to do with processes of Europeanization? How are they in any way interrelated, and how they could be important to understand processes of Europeanization? It would be a legitimate question because, as I said before, these are not topics at the forefront of the research agenda in Europeanization or in EU integration literature, or even in the literature that deals specifically with the EU external relations with the countries of the Western Balkans. There is nascent literature that talks a lot about the very idea that processes related and legislation related to the protection of LGBT plus community have become implicitly and unofficially for a long time now part of the EU integration package. So they have to go hand in hand with the other reformation processes in the countries that seek membership in the European Union. They go hand in hand with good records of human rights, good records of media freedom, and as such, they have become also an important point of debate between the EU itself and the countries that seek to join the EU. But when I wanted to understand how are pride parades in Pristina, how are they an entry point to understand processes of Europeanization, I was driven by this finding. If you are to read reports of many European organizations, many international organizations, you see that the findings are that Kosovo is probably the most homophobic country in the Western Balkans. The Western Balkan countries are in and of themselves also known to be rather homophobic towards and rather conservative patriarchal. Even you find all these denominations in these reports. And I wanted to understand, based on what are these findings based, what is the story behind the numbers that I was seeing. It's like 83% of Kosovars declared they would be against their own children having a same-sex relationship or a same-sex marriage, right? And somehow this was paradoxically cohabitating. So as somebody who follows Kosovo rather slowly, it was somehow weirdly cohabitating with this scenario in place in which LGBT organizations in Pristina, in Kosovo, have been organizing successive pride parades without any incident, really. They were all very much cheered. There were very interesting slogans floating around. I happened to attend 2 of them. This is the one I attended in 2019. And you see floods of people taking the streets of Pristina. You don't see any police officers like creating a corridor for them to pass, like it is the case in many other countries of the Western Balkans, for instance, where you have the police guaranteeing that nobody harasses those who are marching. And it looked like, indeed, there is this seemingly paradoxical cohabitation of these 2 narratives. The most homophobic country in the region manages to organize successful pride parades. Here you have a picture of all the international diplomats in Pristina also partaking in the pride parade, showing their support with slogans in English, obviously. So the locals on the left-hand side picture are also joined by the international diplomats in Pristina on these marches. And here you have yet another picture. This is from earlier on. And you have here Ulrike Lunacek, a member of the European Parliament, also a very known advocate for LGBT plus rights and politics, partaking in the Pride Parade in Pristina to show her support. Here on the right side, you have the US ambassador, the former US ambassador to Pristina, Greg Dalloway. You have the former president, Hashim Thaçi. You have the Minister of Integration right here, and also a number of, let's say, known figures in Kosovo's politics partaking in the Pride Parade as well. In fact, most of the time, the Pride Parades around Pristina are at the forefront of the parade. You have the LGBT activists, but you also have very senior politicians. You usually have the Minister of European Integration, you have the mayor of Pristina, you have the president, the prime minister, and etc. And of course, you have in real time all of these events being advertised and publicly announced on the Twitter accounts of the leaders at that time, showing their support and their activism for the LGBT politics, for the LGBT rights in Kosovo. So I was drawn to this seemingly paradox, like what is really happening here? Because how can all international organizations claim that this is the most homophobic setting in the entire Western Balkans, but at the same time, if you go and partake in the Pride Parade, it's absolutely, it's a really nice party, right? There's, as I mentioned before, there's not even police officers meddling around. It looks like everybody's minding their own business. When I got to talk to LGBT plus activists in Pristina, and when I got to look deeper into what was happening on this entire terrain of performing LGBT politics, I understood that in these seemingly perfect picture images and experiences that I also happened to attend, there was a lot of performing that was going on. There was a lot of staging, and there was a lot of simulation of marching, of protesting, of performing, a lot of simulation that seeked to show Kosovo as this place where LGBT plus rights are completely guaranteed. When I say perform, I'm essentially talking about performative acts as acts that are not necessarily, they're not performances, they are not just theatrical. So there is a certain degree of internalization of the act that the actor is performing in itself. So all these people that I showed you in these images, it's not that they are just there to perform a theatrical show. There is a lot of internalized belief and conviction that these are important issues and they need to show their support about it. But there's also, I understood that there's also a lot of staging to this whole process, to this whole day in the way how it is managed. There is an agreement with the local police in Kosovo for them not to appear in their uniforms, but instead you have police officials who are dressed in as civils, and they permit into the crowd, they partake into the crowd, making sure that nothing gets out of control. But the lack of police uniforms is also part of this staging, a well-curated staging performance in a way to give this image that indeed nothing out of the ordinary is happening here. It is just a complete natural flow of people wanting to march for rights and freedoms of the LGBT community. Right, so this is what you get when you then look into the subterranean level. You see that there is that act of performing something, of performing themselves as Europeans. There's also that act of staging, because that is a very well staged and very well curated performance in a way as well. And in doing so, these actors, so both civil society actors who are advancing their agendas and also local politicians in Kosovo, are also simulating some European ideals or self-ascribed European ideals that want to send the message abroad that, unlike popular belief, Kosovo's politicians are not conservative, they're not, in the book I call them not backward, not Balkan-like, but instead progressive, open, and they adhere to the highest principles, democratic principles, when it comes to protecting the LGBT plus community. That's why it is important for local politicians to appear in such events, because the addressee of these activities, so the addressee of their acts during the pride parades, is not the LGBT community in Kosovo. Much more than that, it is the international technocratic community that is based in Kosovo. It is also the international community in Brussels, Berlin, London, Washington. So spaces where Kosovo's international statehood has been crafted, supported, and legitimized to this very date. And this becomes even clear when I talk then to LGBT plus activists in Pristina. I selected two quotes for you that I think are best in describing what this paradox between between the most homophobic country, the portrayed most homophobic country, and the one that organizes such nice pride parades is all about. Our politicians come on these days to support our cause for 5 minutes. That's it. The rest of the year, they go back to being what they usually are, homophobic, and to feeling how they usually feel, unfriendly towards the LGBT plus community, says a local activist in Kosovo during an interview for the purposes of this book. There have been multiple cases where, even during parliamentary sessions, but also in other public occurrences, many politicians, senior politicians in Kosovo, have resorted to unfriendly language, to put it mildly, unfriendly language towards the LGBT plus community. And then, somewhat paradoxically, you have them also parading them nicely with the community itself when this day comes to be, because, as I mentioned, this is part of a broader set of performances and staging activities whose primary addressee is not the LGBT community, and this is less about protecting and advancing the rights of the LGBT plus community in Kosovo, but it is more about advancing and reconfirming the idea that that European project, that international project to making Kosovo a model European country is working, is functioning. Another quote that I think also illustrates very well this paradox says, "Pride parades are the only moment when our politicians are pitied and even seen as victims by citizens. People look at them at pride parades and say, oh, poor them, they have been asked by the internationals and the Europeans to do this." So across the LGBT plus community in Kosovo itself, there is this awareness that what is happening with politicians parading in the pride parade does not have much to do with them as a community. It does not have much to do with a vociferous determination to actually protect and promote the rights of the LGBT community. Many of them who have been part of the working groups with the governmental units set especially for this purpose do claim that there is usually a very uneasy atmosphere in working with governmental officials. It becomes very clear for them as a community that the government is mainly setting up these working groups, these committees, these departments or what have you, because somewhere in the big matrix of processes of Europeanization that will tick a box somewhere, but it has not much to do with the advancement of the rights of the LGBT community or with the further protection of their rights in terms of advancing the legislation and what have you. One of the tropes that I see Kosovo's politicians use constantly in their discourse when they talk about the LGBT plus community is, let me just go back to this. If you can see here, he says, "As President of Republic, I joined today hundreds of LGBTI activists for Kosovo Love Parade. Kosovo's constitution protects love." And this sentence, so this idea that Kosovo's constitution protects love, Kosovo's constitution guarantees the rights of all communities, of all minorities, be them ethnic, be them sexual, cultural, or what have you, is the trope that I see repeating itself continuously among Kosovo's politicians. And it is true that in Kosovo's constitution, it is stated that so marriage is defined as a willful act between two persons. It is not mentioned that it is an act between a man and a woman, so to speak. Many also laws related to the family law, anti-discrimination laws also point towards that. So unification is defined based on the will of two adult people without specifying their gender or their sexuality, but it is not constraining any dimensions of sexual orientation in such decisions. And this element of the legal infrastructure has been taken and repeated on and on from senior politicians when they want to make a case about how advanced Kosovo's constitution is, how advanced Kosovo's legislation is in protecting the rights of the LGBT plus community. And when doing so, and also appearing themselves at the forefront of the pride parades, they also want to further reinforce that image that not only the legal infrastructure is very advanced, but we have also internalized the very same principles, and we're here to show that we are in full compliance with this legislation, with these best practices of legislation that we have in place. All right. Now, one other element that is very interesting to mention in here is that in these debates about the protection of the LGBT plus community, the protection of sexual minorities in Kosovo is given both by international actors and by many local actors, is given forward as the idea that before the international intervention took place in Kosovo, before 1999, there were really no gays and lesbians in Kosovo, no trans community, no bisexuals, nothing. 1999, intervention happened, and voila, we start to have LGBT plus community in the first place, and we start to talk about their rights. This is the narrative that has been built, and the narrative that continues to dominate the discourses around what LGBT plus politics are in Kosovo, but also more generally in the Western Balkans, and how should they relate to processes of Europeanization, to processes of emancipation or modernization. What I found out by talking to LGBT plus activists, especially by talking to senior LGBT activists, is that pre-war activism in Kosovo and as part of Yugoslavia at the time, pre-war activism in Yugoslavia was very well developed and very well maintained despite the numerous wars that took place throughout the 90s. In the book, I also make an entire case about how these activities were organized, and what you see is that in the pre-war, most of what today we call LGBT plus community or LGBT plus activities were mainly organized by civil society organizations that were more in tune with activism related to literacy, fighting for social justice, or anti-war movements. They were mostly led by women, and they were entirely conducted for free. I have talked to numerous senior activists in Serbia and Kosovo and in Croatia to get this understanding of what was happening prior to the intervention in Kosovo, or prior to the wars in Yugoslavia, in regard to the LGBT plus community. To the contrary, what we see today as a result of the international intervention is that most of this LGBT plus activism is mainly organized through NGOs, through civil society organizations. They are well organized through funding schemes. They report mainly to their donors. So it's an entirely different overview of what is happening with the activism as such. They are obviously completely different because they were also operating in two completely different socio-political and ideological settings. But it goes to show that activism, or activism related to the LGBT community in general, did not really start once the international actors intervened in Kosovo, or once they intervened in the countries of the Western Balkans more generally. By creating these tropes that, we only started to have an LGBT community in 1999, there's also this idea to reinvent Kosovo, what Kosovo is in the present as well, but also in turn legitimize many of the processes related to LGBT plus politics that are given forward through processes of Europeanization. To conclude, as far as the pride parades in Pristina go, there is this, what I call there is a meta performance taking place. So many of the LGBT plus organizations appear in the pride parades because they also have to tick that box to whatever donor organization that they have to report to. Many other civil society organizations that do not work on LGBT plus politics do come in these pride parades, because this is also a venue where you get a legitimacy as a progressive organization, or as a progressive person tied to particular allegiances and not the others. And you also have, as I said, senior politicians for whom this entire setting serves as a venue to send messages to international actors in Kosovo. All right. I hope I was clear as far as the pride parades and the LGBT plus politics in Kosovo go, and how they can help us understand how notions of Europe permeate and how they become co-constitutive to processes that are inherently, let's say, non-political, so to speak. Let us now move forward to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and let us try to see how can we understand processes of Europeanization in Bosnia and Herzegovina by looking at how Europe Day is celebrated in Sarajevo and in other cities around the country. Now, as you might have elaborated at length in your course and in your program, there has been, ever since the end of the war, but also before that, there has been an incremental and comprehensive intervention of European actors, of the European Union, into setting the final arrangements with regard to Bosnia and Herzegovina. The flag that you see also in here is a testimony to that comprehensive intervention. You may know that much like in the case of Kosovo, which also happens to have a similar flag to Bosnia and Herzegovina and to the European Union in terms of color and texture and structure. In both of these cases, there have been what I call for flags initiatives, in which the flags were designed under specific international and European supervision in order not to bear any ethnic attribution and in not attributing to any ethnicity in the country. Both flags, as you can see, end up attributing some European ideals which both countries seek and aspire to become part of. Now, what do I mean by looking at Europe Day? So it is very interesting to mention that Europe Day, as most of you will know, is the 9th of May. So the day when it's celebrated the foundation of the European Union. I don't teach classes in European studies, but I teach classes in political science and IR in Brussels, the capital of Europe. And oftentimes in a room of 100 plus students, very few of them know what Europe Day is or when the Europe Day is, because it's not part of their framework. It just happens not to be very important for them. Most of my students are obviously Western Europeans, or exchange students from the Nordic countries or from the southern countries of the European Union. Europe Day, 9th of May, is celebrated both in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Kosovo, and also in other countries of the Western Balkans as Europe Day, with an immense amount and variety of sport activities, cultural activities. There's poetry night, there's football tournaments, there's film festivals, there's space painting, there's jazz concerts, there's basically everything, right? So you have entire organizations, the delegation of the European Union in Sarajevo, in Belgrade, in Niš, in Pristina, in Tetovo, in where have you, organizing entire activities with the local population, with the local population of these countries to celebrate Europe Day. In countries, for instance, such as Georgia, but also Kosovo, Europe Day is also a public holiday. So just to take to a further level the whole process of wanting to become part of Europe, these are two cases that I find take it a bit to the next level. There are many countries in the world that celebrate Europe Day, even they are not remotely geographically connected to Europe or part of any approximation program or large-scale program with the European Union. 2 years ago, I was in Peru, and the entire month of May was dedicating to celebrate, it was called the Europe Month. So for 30 days, Peruvians took the streets to organize multiple cultural activities, food activities, much like what you see people across the Balkans are doing. So this is not pertinent to Bosnia-Herzegovina or to the Western Balkans in and of itself. Of course, what I look at it here is to understand how such activities, how celebrating Europe in countries that are in the process of becoming members of the European Union in the in the unforeseeable future? How do these activities translate, and how can we make sense of translations of Europe and translations of processes of Europeanization in Bosnia and Herzegovina in this particular case? All right, let me just see. All right, I think I'm running out of time, so I'll continue with Bosnia and Herzegovina in this case. So by looking at how Europe Day was celebrated from 2005 all the way to 2019, I discern three elements in which we can further understand Europeanization in a more critical lens. We have the creation of European places and spaces in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and this is usually taking place in activities organized by the European Union in the National Museum or in very scenic mountains or valleys. And you have EU officials who constantly point to these venues as quintessentially European. So we have this event at this particular museum because the museum clearly shows such a rich Bosnian history, and in extension to that, it also shows Bosnia's aspirations to become a member of the European Union. For instance, in 2018, the city of Prnjavor was picked as the city to celebrate Europe Day, and in their official communication of the European Union delegation to Sarajevo, they said the Prnjavor city is extremely rich in cultural heritage and also known by the symbolic name Little Europe due to large number of national minorities living in the city. This whole idea of multiple national minorities living in one city in Bosnia and Herzegovina from EU officials is given forward as something that is not quite innate to Bosnia and Herzegovina, not quite fitting with the political and social reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is given as something that is quintessentially European, as something that has to be aspired, but in a somewhat paradoxically, the Bosnian experience is detached from having had any meaningful contact with what it means for many nationalities, many ethnic groups living in a particular space. Next, what I see the European Union delegations in Bosnia and Herzegovina are doing is that they create a set of European activities. So they make this cycling day. They also organize something that they call Cycling with the Stars. They gather a lot of Bosnian celebrities and also a lot of EU technocrats. And they have an entire show, basically, where everybody is cycling throughout particular routes. For instance, there is this quote from the EU ambassador to Bosnia and Herzegovina himself. So Cycling Day is an extremely important day for us because we believe that Banja Luka and Bosnia and Herzegovina are part of the European Union, even though they are not formally a member state. We hope that you will one day be for sure. So I spent a lot of time in the book trying to make this connection between how activities such as cycling are used as tropes to basically forge an idea that by embracing these types of activities, hiking and cycling, the European Union is also trying to give a particular image for Bosnians that needs to be embraced in order for them to be considered in the future as proper Europeans. And until local Bosnians are unable to internalize such an image, they will continue to be non-European, like they will continue to remain Balkan. The last one, what I observe in EU's activities in Bosnia and Herzegovina has to do with the creation of European subjects. So who is the main addressee of all these activities, all these speech acts of the European Union delegations in Bosnia and Herzegovina? It's primarily the youth. There are a lot of activities tackling and targeting the youth, and there are a lot of activities of the European Union delegation targeting children. These are the two main subjects with which the delegation seems to be mainly preoccupied with. In one of the speeches directed to this sports event in 2019, the EU ambassador said, being European means accepting differences and being tolerant towards people of other ethnic, political, religious, and cultural orientations. What we see here is, again, a lot of political pedagogy, so to speak, into what it really means to be European and how these subjects, how these Bosnian youth and Bosnian children can become European. And the only way how to do that is, according to this sentence, is by being tolerant towards people of other ethnic, political, religious, and cultural orientations. And all of these activities, places and spaces in which Europe features itself throughout the festivities of Europe Day, celebrations of the Europe Day, Europe is given as this Pleasantville where everything functions, there is no corruption, it's all gender equal, gender neutral, environmentally conscious, as opposed to spaces and places that are non-Europe, which are by extension the opposite of all these denominations that I just enumerated. Let me just see, because I think that is, okay, thank you. Right, and in giving this idea of the Pleasantville, the EU, I argue, not only in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in the countries of the Western Balkans in general, gives this image of an EU that may have never existed in practice in and of itself since the EU existed, right? Because we know there has always been cleavages, crises that are co-constitutive to what the EU is, and they have made and they have written the history of what the EU is and what the EU has been over the past decades. But somehow what I see happening outside of the EU is that the ability of the EU to give forward this image of an EU that is intact, that is amenable to crisis, that is always able to go the step forward. So it's very resilient, and somehow it remains intact as this Pleasantville, where everything functions, where everything is perfect, as opposed to non-European spaces that are exactly the opposite. All right. Lastly, let's go to Tirana. I wish we could do that. The weather there is so nice now. And I look at how specifically one activity, so from the entire chapter of Tirana, I've taken one activity, the biking activity, and I will explain in a moment why is that the case, to understand not only how the EU portrays itself in activities with local Albanians, but also how the local political elite in Tirana has co-opted and has internalized this entire narrative of how a Europeanized Albania and how a Europeanized Albanian subject, Albanian citizen, should look like. In the chapter, I talk at length about the entire processes of redesigning the city of Tirana. And there you have a lot of reference to how the mayor and also other actors from the central government in Albania talk about making Tirana into a European city. So by building 2 more glassy 20-floor buildings, we make Tirana into a more European city. You see the same tropes, the same discourse circulating with regard to how Skopje was made into a European city as well. There is a lot of reference from local politicians in Skopje and also from the politicians at the central government in Skopje about beautifying the city, making it more European, making it less socialist, making it less Oriental or what have you. Similarly to that, there is that rhetoric also in the city of Tirana. What I observe in this case, however, is that the European Union delegation and the EU actors in general are quite at the background of these activities. They are almost not present anymore. These sets of activities, so performing Europe and performing activities that would in turn make Albanians look more European, have been taken, co-opted, and internalized from the local government itself. So when I look back in time, I see that maybe in the early years of mid-2000s, or maybe only towards the end of 2000s, you see the European Union delegation to Tirana having a more active role, let's say, into making celebrations about Europe Day, or organizing yet another event about Europeanization or what have you. Now you have the municipality of Tirana that has created an entire calendar of days, international days of books, international day of cycling, international car-free day, what have you. And in all of these activities, all of these events, you see local politicians reciting the same tropes, the same discourses that I see EU officials cite in other countries of the Western Balkans. In doing so, I argue that there is a lot of staging and performing of Europe happening in Tirana. But as I mentioned before, this is not only taking place from EU officials. This is to a large extent carried out by local politicians in the city. This is a quote from, I'm sorry, I should have had a date there. This is from 2008. It is from the former EU ambassador to Albania on the International Cycling Day. He's making this sentence. This sentence that I have here. But before that, just a little context. So both the EU delegation and the municipality of Tirana decided to mark the International Cycling Day by blocking the two main boulevards of the city, the square of Skanderbeg and also the Mother Teresa Boulevard. They were both blocked for cars, and you had a lot of people, including the mayor, including the EU ambassador, cycling around these areas. And once they stopped to give a little interview, the EU ambassador said, "This is a very important day. It is important that people move around the city in a more rational way, avoiding the heavy traffic and decrease the pollution in the city so that we can all have better air quality for us and our children." And then this last sentence in bold, "Let us have more days like these. Let us be European." The EU ambassador to Tirana in this particular occasion is explicitly suggesting that in order for Albanian citizens to be European, they have to let go of their cars, let go of their obsession with cars, as he said in a later occasion, and embrace biking. So hop on bicycles and try to live, to have a more, what does he say, a healthier or a better air quality life for themselves and for their children. I find this particularly interesting, especially in the way how owning a bike and biking as an activity is given forward as something that innately makes you more European. So this is what is supposed to make Albanian citizens more European. And it is particularly interesting because I don't know to what extent you cover Albanian politics in your program, but Albania had a very harsh communism for more than 50 years. And the only cars that you could trace in Albanian cities were cars of the communist nomenclatura. So ordinary citizens rarely ever had, possessed a car. They were mostly on bikes, actually. This is a picture of, so this is the mayor of Tirana in 2019, again, commemorating one of these car-free days or International Cycling Day. I'm not sure which one was this. And of course, a lot of youth and children and their parents behind in the boulevard. And this is a picture from Tirana in 1961. As I mentioned, during communism, bike was the most preferred mode of transport, but also mode of socializing, because as I said, owning, so like car possession was really something that was mainly a luxury for the communist nomenclatura or for those few wealthy Albanian citizens. So it is very interesting that the EU ambassador is giving forward the idea that in order for Albanians to become more European, they should they should start to make biking as part of their daily routine, as if Albanians have never heard about the bikes before, or they have never been part of their social activities, or they're a part of their social life. What I find it even more interesting is that the mayor itself and also Albanian politicians themselves co-opt this narrative. So they usually, when they hop on bikes and make these performances, they also themselves suggest that this is what European cities look like, you know, more bikes, less cars, somehow sidelining or outright forgetting the entire heritage that existed before. Now, granted, what you see in the picture on the right hand, these Albanians on bikes were not because they were very concerned about environmental degradation, or because they were really just trying to offer a better, better air quality and better physical health, etc. Having bikes was because of economic impoverishment. That is absolutely the case. But it is nonetheless interesting how something that has existed and is actually one of the very stereotypes of Albanian communism is in turn used both by EU officials in Tirana and by local politicians proper to give forward the idea of how can Albanian subjects be Europeanized. Now, in addition to simulating Europe and to performing Europe, we also have a lot of talk on lecturing Europe. Now, in countries such as Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, also North Macedonia to a large extent, we see mainly EU officials, EU technocrats lecturing about best practices in Western European countries, best practices in the EU, and how they can be internalized from countries and societies in the Western Balkans. Again, what I see happening in the case of Albania is that local politicians have very interestingly well co-opted this narrative, and they do the lecturing on how and what needs to be Europeanized and how. For instance, in one of the lectures for the LSE Cities series in 2019, the mayor himself, the mayor of Tirana, said something like, we introduced yoga in the parks, even though people were saying we are not Dutch, we are not gay, we are Albanians, but the municipality did it. This is to show that even in the most conservative, backward, Eastern European, former communist mentality, people do yoga, no one has a problem with it. There is a lot to unpack here, but this is given on the occasion on how the mayor has basically worked to creating more green areas, to creating more parks, and also to not allow construction of several buildings in an area that was very close to the park. And he's instead suggesting that, to the contrary, he has created an entire program, financed an entire program where people could go and do yoga for free. Now, the narrative on which he's basing this discourse at his lecture for the LSE cities is that there is this setting where, we're practically, what conservative, backward, Eastern European former communist mentality. And here I am with this Europeanizing agenda for the city, and I'm changing single-handedly the way how local Albanians think, even though he says we're not Dutch, we're not gay. I'm still rather unsure, how does one lead to the other, but maybe the mayor can have the time to explain that for himself at some point. But it is interesting how this sort of narrative is this self-internalized Balkanism, self-internalized Orientalization of self, in a way, has been co-opted well by the local politicians. And I singled out the mayor of Tirana in this case, because I'm talking about the biking and the city, but you see the same narrative also circulating across other politicians as well in Albania and also in other countries of the Western Balkans. And again, as I mentioned before, in relation to the yoga and being Dutch and not being gay and what have you, there is this entire spectrum of imagining Europe. So the way how Europe is imagined in Tirana, but also in North Macedonia, also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, also in Kosovo, is through and via orientalizing non-Europe. So basically this idea of Europe as a Pleasantville is also in the countries of the region is imagined by orientalizing and essentializing non-European spaces as something that are inherently backward, stuck in time, unable to progress. For instance, in a TV show and prime time, the mayor of Tirana says himself, "I'm determined to think that Tirana should be turned into a Western city, not a city like Calcutta, where everyone is lying down everywhere and selling things on the street." For the symbolic geography of West, so Western city on the one hand, and the symbolic geography of Calcutta is this clear distinguishing this dialectical mechanism through which the mayor is operating and through which many leaders across the countries of the Western Balkans operate, in which the Western city, a Western cluster, is essentialized as inherently good, as inherently progressive and open, as opposed to non-European spaces, non-European geographies that are something like it is given in relation to this particular case, where everything is lying down everywhere and selling things on the street. So even the imaginations of the aesthetics of a city are rendered to these very implausible views of what a Western city is and what a non-Western city is. Just to tie in together at the very end, but I'm sure most of you know this, many of these debates, as I also talk about in the book, point to the thesis of Orientalism, indeed that notion of what part of symbolic geography are we part of? What part of a symbolic geography do we want to be part of? And a lot of these tensions with the pride parades in Pristina, with celebrating Europe Day in Sarajevo, with beautifying the city spaces in Skopje, and with biking in Tirana, have to do with this well-ingrained notion of the region belonging or stuck into a non-European space, and by implication into a region that is inherently backwards as opposed to the space where we are aiming to be part of. All right, I will leave it here, and hopefully we can discuss this further. If you have any comments or questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Great. Thank you very much, Vjosa, for providing both the overview of the larger book's argument as well as these three fascinating case studies. Thanks.